Hi, we're inside the church now. Just showed you a lovely picture of it from the outside. This is actually a stained glass picture of St. George that was put here in 1985 to the glory of God and in memory of Reverend Randy Cossett, of course, one of our first reverends. So this shows St. George again slaying the dragon, and is an important image for us. So today I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about some of the hardships that happened here at St. George's. Right now we're facing a lot with the coronavirus, and we're all in self-isolation, most of us. And it seems like a very trying time for us. We're not able to reach out to each other like we could, and we have to only leave to get what we necessarily can get, or many of us just need people to come and bring things to us. Fortunately, I can get out and come to this beautiful church. But there's some interesting things about the church and stories through the ages that really tell us about the nature of the people who were here and the priests that were here. And St. George's, of course, was a garrison church first, and there was a padre who took care of the church. He was from the 33rd Regiment, the 1st Regiment here. And right after him, when they were just beginning the construction of the church in 1785, was when Cossett arrived. And the interesting thing about Cossett was he wasn't part of the military. He was someone who was a loyalist. So, of course, he had lived through the War of Independence in the United States, and he was feeling a lot of pressure before he came here to practice his religion, especially being Church of England, and he was trained in England. So he came to St. George's Church to be our new reverend to this new colony that had just been created in the 1780s. And he was a wonderful reverend. I think one of the most interesting stories about him, and this speaks to his character, but it also speaks to the time he lived in. It's the story of Sweet Diana. Now, Diana was a young girl who lived in Sydney. She was 15 years of age. And she was a slave. She was brought here by a group of loyalists that came to Sydney under the direction of a gentleman by the name of Couillère. And Diana was ruined and defiled, is how the Reverend Cossett put it in his log entry for the day. And she was pregnant. She was pregnant with twins. And of course, like I said, she was a slave. So at 15 years of age. So the Reverend was, I suspect, probably witness to what happened to her. And the first baby that was delivered of the twins was fine. The second baby died, and Diana died during childbirth. And the Reverend took her body, her being a slave, which at the time, of course, didn't mean very much to our society. He took her and he saw that she was buried in our graveyard. We don't know where in the graveyard. Some people think she's under the altar, but they think everybody's under the altar. They're not. They're all over the graveyard, and it was a big graveyard. So we figured Diana's there. And I think it really speaks to Reverend Cossett's spirit as a person and a man of God, that at this time of incredible strife for the African American and African Canadian communities, he went out of his way to see that this young child really had a burial in a place where she would be honored. Her family has since contacted us because the twin that survived has ancestors. They live in the southern United States. They've come here to visit, and they would like to put up a memorial to Diana in our graveyard. So we may do that someday. So moving on through time, of course, several things happened, but the next big event for St. George's would have been the Crimean War. And what that marked for the church was a big change in the congregation, because it was no longer required to be a garrison church, although still considered a garrison church, and we have strong affiliation with Victoria Park. The garrison was pulled out, and they were a Black Watch garrison at that time, and they went to the Crimean War. So that was probably a time of difficulty for the church, but we have to remember at that time too, the Highland Scots were coming. They had been coming since the turn of the century in 1800, and they were making up part of the congregation, and were being baptized and buried and the like. So then we move on through time, and of course the next wars we saw were the First and Second World War. And we have a couple of, just one second here, I'm going to turn this around. We have a couple of plaques here. Now the first one I'll show you, I'll have to get up on a bench here. Getting good at climbing around this old church, I'll tell you. This one here is to the First World War, and it is a listing of all of the members of the church that served in the First World War. And they would have, of course, served for king and country, and especially this being an Anglican church, that would have meant a lot to them. There is one person that was killed in action, and that was Ronald Waterhouse, and his name, of course, is highlighted here, marked by a cross, a red cross. So St. George's, of course, dealt with the war and had a lot of people come through it, and then after the war, of course, there was the Great Spanish Flu. And the Spanish flu came in 1918 through 1920. And I would imagine St. George's buried quite a few people through that. I don't have access to the archives right now, but I am going to get some information. I'm going to call and see if I can get the girls out at the Beaton Institute to look it up for me, just to see how many people we actually buried from St. George's that were victims of the Spanish influenza. So time passed. We, of course, had the Depression in the 30s, which would have been most likely difficult times at the church. But people carried on and still came here and still supported it. And we had wonderful rectors who helped people at the time. And then came the Second World War. And this plaque here is the parish of St. George for God and King, the honor roll. And it is all of the members that served in the Second War from the congregation. And we had 2 members killed in action here. We had a Donald John McNeil and a Frank Stewart. So the Second World War was a difficult time as well. And of course, we came through that too, didn't we? We all survived that. And it was, of course, probably a very difficult time here at St. George's, because very few men were left in the community. And indeed, the women took over running the steel plant at that time, because this, of course, was the age of steel. Got to be careful, I'll trip myself getting by the pulpit here. So we moved through time, and there was a couple of reverends that, of course, in my time I've known here at St. George's, that faced difficult parts of society in our community. And one that I think really needs to be highlighted is Rev Mel Finley. Now, Rev Mel Finley was here from 1977 till 1992. He and his wife, Sheila, were very involved in the church. They did incredible things. Sheila painted the organ, got it all back to the way it was supposed to look, and Reverend Finley, along with the vestry, they decided to dig out under the basement and make the basement into a place where they could have Sunday school. And of course, they had to move things around in the church to do that. So you can see these stairs were put in at that time, and the font, which would have been right where these stairs, where this gate is, because it would be right as you came in the front doors of the church, was moved over into the corner there. So when they were digging up the basement, they found a soldier, and actually he was a sergeant, and he was buried right about, right about here. And they didn't anticipate finding anyone under the church, but they did find the sergeant. And first thing they had to do was call the RCMP. And the RCMP came in, and they went and they had to do a 2-week investigation to figure out who this gentleman was. And it was obvious he was from a long time ago because he was put there before the floors of the church, which were put down, which were not put down until about 1790. So he would have been part of the garrison. So after they identified him as best they could, and of course realized it probably wasn't a murder. If it was, it would have been difficult to solve. They moved his body underneath the sanctuary here. So he's buried just beyond the cement wall of the basement. The basement wall only goes up to, of course, this wall here. So just beyond where the choir would sit. Mel Finley worked very hard towards helping our community. As a community-minded person, he believed in an ecumenical community of Christians in Cape Breton. And he brought together all of the different churches from throughout the Sydney area in particular. And he wanted for them to do mission and outreach. And what they decided to do when they got together was they decided that they were going to take the church hall, which is now Loaves and Fishes, and the parish of St. George's donated it under the direction of Mel Finley, and this council of churches started Loaves and Fishes, which is one of the most important social outreaches that we have in this community, and it has a lasting legacy from the time they did it until today, which was probably in the late 70s, and now we're in 2020. So he saw a need, and a need that we still have today that we face with people being hungry, and his legacy lives on through that. Now, I'll leave you with one last story, and this story is about the first female reverend at St. George's, who came right after Reverend Mel Finley died, and that was in 1992. And her name was Reverend Lori Ramsey, and she contributed greatly to the church. We were very blessed to have her. She was a wonderful reverend. Now, I'm showing you right now the royal pew. You'll notice it's marked with this embroidery here that one of our volunteers had made up for it. This is actually where in 1967, when the Queen Mum came to visit us for a service one Sunday morning, this is where she sat. So this being a royal church, by royal decree, the royal family would come here for services when they visited Sydney. When Queen Elizabeth II came to visit in the mid-90s, she actually had her service at not St. George's because we couldn't accommodate that many people. We can get about 200 people in here, 175 comfortably. But we had it at Center 200, and she had an ecumenical service so that we could have all people of all faiths involved. That's a foundation of the Church of the Anglican Church and the Church of England, that we include people of all forms of Christianity in our worship, in our communion, and in the way we operate our mission and outreach in the community. So I'm just going to have a seat here and talk about one more dark time at St. George's. It came in 2001, September 11th, and for us at St. George's that day was a typical cruise ship day. We have, every year now, we have about 25,000 visitors come. Actually, this year we may not see any cruise ship visitors. We'll see what happens. But it was a pretty typical day, a pretty typical Tuesday morning, I believe. And of course, the Twin Towers were hit, and the Pentagon was hit, and of course, the plane that went down. And Reverend Lori Ramsey immediately came to the church, and the visitors were, of course, just learning about this at the time. And she began to minister. And she sat right here in the royal pew, and people came and they took a seat beside her. And she counseled them. And for 3 days, she counseled cruise ship visitors. And she helped them through what was, for many Americans, the darkest thing they'd seen in their generation. They had never thought of America being under attack or being at war. And in the beginning, we really didn't know how this was going to go. We didn't know if this was going to be the Third World War. And many of these people were very concerned about their people at home and their families and those that loved them. And they had people at home worrying about them because they were outside of the country at such a difficult time. But I really think it's important that we realize the role St. George's played in that disaster, in being here for people who came from another foreign place, well, America, which is pretty close to home, but, you know, Americans that came here and sought solace 200 and some odd years after the first Loyalists came here. So we're pretty proud of Reverend Lori Ramsey. She's in Truro now, and they are very blessed to have her as their reverend there. So I'll leave you with this stained glass window. This is in memory of the Honorable John Borneo, and he actually created the rules that are parliamentary rules, much like Robert's Rules of Order. And this stained glass window is the most valuable window in the church. And the reason it is because it depicts the baptism of Jesus by a rabbi. And that's a very rare scene in stained glass windows. So I'm going to sign off for today. I know I went a little long again, but haven't been here in a couple of days. And when you get me talking about St. George's, I just get all passionate and want to tell you everything I know. So I hope you're staying safe and you continue to watch our videos, and we'll get more research and share more. And of course, tomorrow, Jimmy McNeil is coming, and he is going to play our beautiful Cassavant organ from 1910 for us. And he will also talk to us about what makes this organ a little unique in Cape Breton. So have a great day. Stay safe. Bye-bye for now.